Okay, I'm going to try it. If you've been around for very long, you remember my first encounter with Monsieur Z and how that went in his video about how Woodrow Wilson did nothing wrong. A lot of you told me, hey, give him another chance. Some of his other stuff's not quite so insane as that. So we're going to try it. So this is his video, What If D-Day Failed? Hopefully, I don't have to beat myself in the face with a shoebox this time. So we'll see. If you do want to check out my reaction to that other Monsieur Z video, I'll put a link down in the bottom as well as at the end of the video so you can check that out. But let's go ahead and dive into this one and see what happens.
The Second Great War, as most of us know, broke clashing in a variety of ways, perhaps the mightiest states the world had ever seen. The devastating dynamo that was the German war machine pressing forward against the immense titan which was the Soviet Union. The Germans also needing to contend with the globe-sprawling British Empire and rising superpower of the United States, all of whom remained very weary of one another's ambitions. The French, who had initially challenged Germany's expansion alongside Britain, were quickly knocked out of the game in a swift German invasion, leaving behind only ragtag resistance forces and minor British assets stationed on the continent, before themselves being driven out not only there but throughout the whole of the mainland, from Norway to Greece. Britain would thus be forced to combat Germany by sea, by air, and in far-off lands, doing whatever possible to hinder German success. But beyond merely impeding German efforts, the British would remain determined to regain continental ground, and specifically, to liberate France. As the Germans grew confident of Britain's limitations, but anxious of the Soviets' rising capabilities, so was attention shifted eastward, bringing the formerly opposed British and Soviets to a mutual understanding through sheer necessity. The war would wear hard on the USSR, whilst Britain had yet to break the mainland, even now with American support. Although victories had been achieved in North Africa and other parts of the Near East, such had not been sufficient to slow Germany's eastward advance, leading Stalin to demand of his allies that a western front be opened to mitigate the great strain placed upon the Soviet Union.
So it's important, let's kind of stop there and just think about what's happening and think about how people generally view things, okay? We love, when we study history, to talk about make or break moments, decisive moments where the fate of the entire thing hangs in the balance, right? The Battle of Gettysburg, the turning point of the American Civil War. If the South wins Gettysburg, it's over. And the Union wins a desperate victory that they have to have, and after that, everything goes against the South. D-Day, if the Allies aren't able to successfully gain a beachhead at Normandy, the war could be lost. We love to do those things. Waterloo, the moment when Napoleon was finally defeated. All three of those are crap, and so are most of the other things like that. Things are rarely as decisive as we make them out to be. Now, there are moments when the trajectory can change, but Gettysburg did not decide the American Civil War. If the South had won that battle, I'm telling you, it didn't mean squat, because Vicksburg had still been taken, Europe was still not going to intervene, and the war was still going to be won by the Union. That's just the reality, folks. Waterloo did not decisively defeat Napoleon. Well, it did, but what I mean is, had Napoleon won, it wouldn't have been a different outcome, because then there would have been another Waterloo, and he would have been defeated no matter what. Waterloo meant nothing in the grand scheme of things, because he wasn't going to win that war. And if the Allies had not been successful on D-Day, the Germans were still going to lose. The only thing that changes is what the post-war Europe looks like. That's the main reason why D-Day matters. So let's keep all of that in perspective with this.
1943, ground had finally been taken in Italy, who soon surrendered only to come under German occupation. Geography and a series of German defensive lines would make Allied advance through the peninsula a great challenge, thus a quicker, more strategically significant front needed to be opened, and the answer would finally present itself as an invasion of the French beaches of Normandy, an effort commonly known as Operation Overlord, or simply D-Day.
So the other thing we need to keep in mind is that while the Soviets were kind of single-handedly going to win the war in Europe eventually, they weren't single-handedly doing that, okay? the Soviets did not do that by themselves. They had massive amounts of help from the Allies, particularly the Americans, but also the British and others, in terms of supply and weapons and manufacturing and things that they could not have possibly stood up against the Germans without. If the United States is completely neutral in World War II, in other words, they don't give any financial support, they don't give any material support to the British, to the Russians, to anybody, Germany wins World War II. That is not to say that the United States won the war, because you could also say the same thing without the Russians fighting on the Eastern Front. Germany wins World War II. You know, there's no this, that, or the other. It took the combined effort of all the Allies, the British standing in the West by themselves for a while. It all mattered.
The Normandy invasions proved to be a great turning point in the conflict, not only in a strategic sense, but in boosting Western morale as well. The seeming impenetrable Atlantic Wall meant to lock out the British had been broken, the Germans no longer secure on their western front struggled to hold off advancing armies from east and west, and Vichy France was abandoned so that troops could remobilize closer to the German border, in essence surrendering the French south to the Allies. While Italy might have held off an Allied invasion of Germany for another year or two, it was clear to quite a few in the German high command that if northern France was successfully taken, the war would certainly be lost, and so it had been. The Allies of the West and East converging upon Berlin some months later, defeating Germany and bringing the European theater of the war to a close. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline the D-Day invasion had failed? It hadn't been an outcome far out of the realm of possibility. General Eisenhower even drafted a letter of regret in which he would assume full responsibility for the operation's failure if in fact things did not go according to plan.
Yeah, you have to remember, I mean, there were a lot of contingencies that were connected to Operation Overlord, and there were projections that made things look bad, and there were a lot of questions that they didn't have answered until that day. You know, a lot of expectation that the airborne could see anywhere from like 50 to 80% casualties on day one. There were questions about, is the beach really strong enough to hold tanks when they land? Will there be a German counterattack by the Panzer divisions that push them back off the beach once they land? These were all things that were kind of up in the air. But again, I don't know where he's going to go with this, but I'm just throwing my what if out there. If D-Day fails, the outcome of the war doesn't change. The outcome of the peace does. That's just my thoughts.
The Germans as well had long exaggerated the strength of the Atlantic Wall, which proved to be to their own detriment, as because Britain held air superiority, they were quite capable of evaluating German defenses beforehand, whilst many German commanders were simply lulled into a false sense of security as to the fortifications of the Western Front. The key exception had been General Erwin Rommel, who'd been sent to inspect and improve upon current coastal defenses. He'd conclude that the Atlantic Wall was, at best, 18% finished, and hurried to install additional measures, although resources were in great part siphoned off to other areas of the war.
So I think some people are under the misconception that Rommel was actually in command of the defenses at Normandy. He wasn't. Von Rundstedt had overall command in that area, but Rommel was put in charge of building those defenses, and he did a lot of really smart things to prevent, for example, paratrooper landings, and to make it harder for gliders to land. And he did some things on the beach that were going to make things more difficult for beach landings. He did some really smart things. The problem was he just didn't have the resources to do it to the level he felt it needed to be done. And because he didn't have command of all of the troops on the Western Front, he couldn't make the military preparations as far as how to counterattack and all that the way he would have liked to.
Germany also had an opportunity to strategically station a number of tank divisions in preparation for a crushing counterattack. However, these forces had been split three ways, with only one division actually in place to counterattack on the first day. We'll assume things go a bit differently this time, be it through a more effective fortification of the Atlantic Wall or some other factor which leaves the Allies at a disadvantage. By some means, the invasion is simply repelled. The Allies immediately feel the impact of this loss as plans are scrapped and internal divides grow wider. Some have assumed that given the tremendous loss of life even in our own timeline, a defeat at Normandy would lead an ashamed General Eisenhower to resign, something backed up not only by the letter in which he assumed full responsibility for the outcome, but by the fact that he had been losing his patience with Britain and had threatened on two occasions to return to the US.
See, the reason Eisenhower gets chosen for this role of being the commander-in-chief. Number one, because he's from the United States, and the United States is seen, at least by the Western allies, as the main power. And so they're given that kind of place of prestige. But he's also very diplomatic. And he's one of the few guys who seems to have the ability to bring together these different generals from different nations to deal with de Gaulle from France and to deal with people like Montgomery from the British. And most of the men immediately under Eisenhower then, like in charge of the air forces and in charge of the naval forces and in charge of the ground invasion, are all going to be British. So that kind of balances things out a little bit. I'm not entirely sure that a failed D-Day invasion means Eisenhower's job, though, but I suppose it's possible.
Whether or not Eisenhower does resign, the severity of this loss does certainly follow him in his post-war years, costing him any major chance of winning the presidency in 1952. Speaking of presidency, this loss would also harm Roosevelt during the 1944 election, just some months after the planned invasion. While Roosevelt is still likely to defeat Dewey simply based on historic public support for an incumbent president during wartime, he does do so by a much narrower margin, potentially setting Dewey up for a victory in 48 when he goes up against Roosevelt's former Vice President Truman.
That's an excellent point, and I didn't really think about the political ramifications, and I guess it depends on what would happen after D-Day, because, if the Allies turn around and have a successful operation somewhere else at some point, although I don't know if that would have happened, because I feel like there was a window there that if they aren't successful, it's probably quite a while, and probably fair to say that we're not making a lot of progress by the time of the elections in November of 1944. But excellent point about Dewey, because Dewey very nearly wins that 48 election anyway. So if Dewey had been more successful against FDR, and I agree FDR would have won anyway, but if it is a closer election, I think that does set him up better to take on Truman in 48.
Although there had been a mutual understanding of Normandy's value, the operation had greater support from Roosevelt than it did Churchill, who instead favored attacking the Axis from the more vulnerable south, a region he termed Europe's soft underbelly. It was because of this that Operation Overlord, originally Operation Sledgehammer, was meant to coincide with Operation Anvil, later renamed Operation Dragoon.
So Hammer and Anvil, you see. And this isn't something that gets talked about a lot, is the follow-up invasion that happens down there around Marseille. In the aftermath, I think it was in August of 1944, they land on the southeast of France. And it's a natural place to go because you've taken most of Italy, you've taken Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, so you've got a very natural place from which to launch that invasion. And it's important to open up as many fronts as possible to spread out the German defense.
As the names might suggest, the plan had been to capture southern French ports to establish a sturdy base, and to come down upon German forces through an overwhelming northern push, like a hammer striking metal on an anvil. Logistic issues made the coinciding plans impossible, and so Dragoon was carried out sometime following Overlord as a standalone operation. In our world, the effectiveness of Operation Overlord demanded that Germany pull the majority of its forces in the south to instead hold off the advancing Allies. Thus, when Dragoon was carried out in the south, it was met with relatively little resistance, and proved an overwhelming success. However, because the Allies are repelled in the north, the south remains well supplied, meaning if Dragoon is carried out, it could still prove a disaster for Britain, whose population had already been, as Churchill himself supposedly put it, running on fumes.
I'll challenge that a little bit. I feel as though, had the Allies been unsuccessful in Normandy, they weren't going to throw together another plan to invade Normandy very soon after, I don't think. But since the plans were already starting to work, or starting to be in place for the invasion from the south, I think maybe an unsuccessful northern campaign means that they double down on the landing from the south and maybe put more resources into that. And I feel like they could still be successful there, especially if they can make it seem like they're going to try again in the north. So I don't know, just an alternate way of looking at that.
Considering the great toll the failed Normandy invasion had brought, Britain may hesitate to attempt a second invasion even in the less defended south. Dragoon had after all been a compromise between the US and UK as to an invasion site, but if we assume that 1, American involvement would be compromised by Eisenhower's departure, and 2, Britain is less willing to attack a risky target, the outcome might instead be to launch an invasion of the oil-rich Balkans from Italy, as Churchill had originally planned.
Yeah, and we had actually fooled the Germans into thinking that the landings were going to happen in Greece instead of in Sicily. There's this movie just came out about that recently, Operation Mincemeat. There were plenty of reasons for the Germans to believe the attack would come in the Balkans.
Stalin strongly opposed this, as he asserted it would intrude upon his sphere of influence. However, this was precisely the reason Churchill insisted on such an operation, understanding that he could cut Germany off from petroleum assets and thus significantly weaken them, as well as place the West in a more advantageous negotiating position with the Soviets post-war.
And this is all incredibly important because by 1944, a huge part of all military decision-making by the Western Allies, and by the Western Allies, I mean primarily the Americans and the Brits, but also the French and others that are involved too, Canadians and other nations, but primarily the British and the Americans. All of that is being decided with the idea of the post-war political situation in Europe and how do we slow Stalin's influence in Europe.
It's reasonable to assume this invasion would go along much easier than its alternatives. However, the matter isn't so much if it can be done successfully, but what reaction the USSR might have to it. If we assume the British invasion of the Balkans takes place around the same time Dragoon was carried out in our world, this would lead the British to directly encounter Soviet troops along the eastern Serbian border, just as Bulgaria and Romania fell under Eastern occupation. The plan at that point would be to advance northward toward Austria and Hungary before pressing forward toward Berlin. This change of strategy would no doubt drive divides between the Allies, including the US and UK. Roosevelt, not taking kindly to Churchill's domineering oversight, perhaps shifts attention toward the war in the Pacific instead of the Balkan campaign.
And, you know, the Americans are fighting in both Europe and the Pacific, but it was decided pretty early on in the war that it was going to be a Germany first strategy, which was that the priority was take down Germany while we're moving and doing the island hopping thing in the Pacific. So it was always understood that Germany was going to be the first one to be defeated and then the Japanese. It's interesting, though, that it seems like the whole direction of his alternate history is going to be predicated on this idea of the Allies invading the Balkans. I don't know that they could have put that kind of a plan together by the fall of 1944. Unless they already had contingency plans in place for that.
If so, this would drastically slow Britain's advance, allowing Hungary and even Austria to fall to the Soviets, making the invasion ultimately pointless. Alternatively, as to not tread heavily on Stalin's toes, Churchill might instead opt to invest more heavily in aerial bombardment. Chief Marshal of the Royal Air Force Sir Arthur Harris had been a strong believer that tactical bombing raids on German cities would ultimately bring about a surrender. As we know from our timeline, a German surrender did not come easy, and it's unlikely mere bombing raids would achieve a victory for Britain. However, there's much opportunity for this to have become perhaps one of the darkest outcomes for the war. By 1945, France is still under German occupation, and rockets continued to strike Britain even despite misinformation tactics which at least managed to keep many from striking London directly.
And I will say this, too, that you got to remember that by 1945, the technology would be continuing to improve on these V-2 rockets. And if Germany is able to survive this long without Allied advances across Western Europe, then they're able to get more of their jet fighters into position to fight. And the technology maybe has an opportunity to make more of a difference.
The Soviets without Western support continue to advance slowly but surely, although the current pace might indicate another year or two before the war is over. Stalin, frustrated with the ineffectiveness of Britain, is no longer expected to remain within his sphere of influence, leaving Britain desperate for any alternative. In our world, Churchill had wrote to his military chiefs, quote, "I should be prepared to do anything that will hit the enemy in a murderous place. I may certainly have to ask you to support me in using poisonous gas." This proposal had been made exactly 1 month following the D-Day landings, and speaks quite a bit to the desperate state Churchill had already been in. He would write further, "We could drench the cities of the Ruhr and many other cities in Germany, and if we do it, let us do it 100%.
I'm curious, too, to see whether or not he goes into how the atomic bomb might be a part of all this. Because remember, the U.S. has been working on this at this point, and so that's still happening. And I guess there's a chance then that we could see the atomic bomb used in Europe instead.
His military chiefs initially rejected the proposition, fearing German retaliation in equal or greater scale, not to mention the public outrage that would come from such an action. Churchill, however, simply responded, quote, I am not at all convinced by this negative report. The matter should be kept under review and brought up again when things get worse. Eventually, the consideration began to approach reality. An earlier initiative known as Operation Vegetarian, which involved infecting the German food supply with an anthrax bioweapon, was revived in the form of using anthrax bombs against 6 major German cities. The plot was only abandoned because by the time the bombs were ready, the war was nearly over. This time, things are different. Much like the US in the Pacific, the British are growing weird.
Now, I say not cool, and it seems horrifying to us to think, man, they would really drop anthrax on German cities? That's horrible. But it's really not all that different than the firebombing of Dresden, for example, which incinerates tens of thousands of civilians. There's something about chemical and biological warfare that makes us go, ooh, that's bad. But it's really no different than mass incendiary bombings, really, if you think about it.
Fury while their adversary remained unshaken. Bombing raids and invasion proved too slow a strategy, and so drastic measures were taken. Unlike Truman, there's much doubt over how hesitant Churchill would have been to unleash his own weapon of mass destruction. As far as he was concerned, there was little difference in using such weapons in this Great War, as earlier versions had been used in the prior Great War. As you might expect, the effects are devastating. The 6 German cities targeted are rendered uninhabitable. But this attack doesn't end the war just yet. It's believed that the Germans had by 1945 stockpiled some 80,000 tons of chemical weapons in the event one of their opponents used WMDs first. Had Britain initiated this exchange, Germany would unleash its own arsenal of far deadlier agents against both Britain and the Soviets.
That's absolutely true, and the Allies, I know, were prepared for that possibility. My wife's grandfather, who was a ball turret gunner on a B-17, was also the kind of chemical weapons guy for their unit. He was the one who was responsible for keeping track of all of their defensive stuff, their gas masks, all their protective gear that they might need in the event that happened at their base.
It's not clear who would come out on top in the aftermath of such a situation, if the 3 would agree to a ceasefire and ultimately resolve issues diplomatically, or if the Soviets, through benefit of being so distant from the battlefield, might take advantage of the situation to exert influence over the weakened Britain and Germany. Or perhaps Britain remains untouched as Germany is unable to effectively deliver their weapons overseas. Whatever the outcome, this would be one catastrophic possibility. But let's backtrack a bit and consider the British invasion of the Balkans once again. Let's assume that the US continues to back Britain just to ensure the Soviets don't overwhelm them completely and demand more than previously negotiated. Major oil fields in Romania, just as in our world, are still captured by the Soviets on account of proximity and an unwillingness to allow so close a state to fall under Western influence. This increased effort in the south may hinder Soviet advance in the north, but only minimally. Western efforts are in great part wasted in the Yugoslav region, which would have come under control of Tito's partisan forces. This does, however, allow for a British occupation of Albania before it fell to communist insurgents. The speedy victory in Yugoslavia also becomes a springboard from which to invade Austria and Hungary, aiming to sweep westward and retake Belgium and the Netherlands, whilst the Soviets approach Berlin, bringing the war to a close. While this plan of invading the Balkans just to circle back around to France might seem convoluted, it plays best to the strategy the Western Allies would have had to adopt. A march toward Berlin could be attempted, but given the pace at which the Soviets were closing in, it may prove a safer strategy to capture well ahead of where the Soviets might intend to expand.
Now, I still have a hard time believing that in that situation there wouldn't have been an attempted landing again, either in the Normandy area or at Calais, or even again down around Marseille. If the idea originally was land at Normandy and then land at Marseille and kind of push together, I have to believe they're still going to want to do that. They're pushing up through Italy, pushing up through the Balkans. I still think they're going to want a landing and a front in France somewhere. So I think that would have happened at some point.
France couldn't be secured through direct invasion nor routing through Italy, and so rather than take France back before war's end, the West would simply need to block it off from Soviet access and return to finish the job once the war was over. Because of the southern route taken by the Allies, occupation zones are divided diagonally along a northeast-southwest line, with communist Yugoslavia being a key exception. The Yugoslavia of this world could end up divided in two, with a socialist republic along the coast and a kingdom more inland, simply because the Soviets are never able to link up with the partisans in this timeline due to Western occupation. Albania is also placed in a dual monarchy with Italy as to secure it from its larger neighbors, something which had originally been considered years prior, and which formed part of the official basis for their annexation by Italy in 1939. Hungary, Austria, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic are maintained within the Western Bloc, along with southern Germany, however at the cost of the Scandinavian countries, which came under Soviet occupation following efforts to neutralize their pro-German governments.
So here's another question I have during all of this, is remember that in our historic timeline, the UK has an election, and Churchill's actually voted out. He's no longer the prime minister as of the summer of 1945, which granted is after the end of the war in Europe, but the war in the Pacific is still going on, which the British are involved in. So depending on when this timeline's war in Europe takes place, is there a situation where Churchill is ousted while the war is still going on against Germany? And if so, what does Clement Attlee do differently, if anything at all?
Sweden, though neutral during the war, and Finland having earlier negotiated peace, would still fall under hefty Soviet influence and see favor for Communist Party's rise through both legal and social pressures. The delayed Western support of this alternate world also discourages the Soviets from major involvement against Japan, leaving the Pacific War to rest in great part upon American efforts. Now, it's been suggested by some that the impending threat of Soviet conquest had been what truly motivated the Japanese to surrender, and while there's partial truth to this, the strains which drove Japan to this desperate state came primarily from US actions.
Yeah, I'm not one of those people who tends to think that, oh yeah, it was definitely the fact that the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, not the atomic bombs. I think we're trying to redirect too far in that direction. We should acknowledge the fact that, Stalin agrees that within a couple of months after the end of the war in Europe that he will declare war on Japan, and he does that as agreed. And he does that right about the time that the atomic bombs are getting dropped, and so this all kind of happens at once. Did it play into it? Was it a factor? Probably. Was it as big a factor as some people say? I'm not so sure, but...
The Soviets breaking their pact of peace with Japan had been startling, as the Japanese North went largely undefended in order for resources to be diverted against the US, meaning Japan was woefully underprepared to fight in this new front. The Soviets had also captured one of Japan's last major resource hubs, leaving them without the means to fuel their war effort. You might even say that the USSR's entry into the war with Japan had been an Eastern equivalent to the D-Day invasion. That being said, Japan had been running on fumes since late 1944. Resources, manpower, and naval weaponry were nearly depleted. All possible courses of action appeared bleak, leading to much disagreement within the high command and restlessness from within the Japanese population. Something only escalated by the dropping of the atomic bombs, impending threat of American invasion, and an overall lack of preparation on the mainland islands. The military was tired, the people were tired, and even the emperor was tired.
Yeah.
As one Japanese admiral had put it, the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry into the war are, in a sense, divine gifts. This way we don't have to say that we quit the war because of domestic circumstances. Given the lack of incentive, the Soviets might delay their invasion until the end of their peace pact with Japan, some 9 or so months after the invasion had begun in our world. The end result being that the US would occupy much of Japan's captured territories, with the exception of a few islands which Stalin had asserted claim to during the earlier conferences. Because the Soviets don't invade Japanese conquests in northern China, it remains outside of communist control, thus when the resumed Chinese Civil War begins, the communists are left without the safe haven provided to them by the USSR in the north, ultimately allowing China to return to nationalist rule. While the Soviets...
Now that, if that were to happen, that would be enormous. I mean, that would be super huge if you don't have the communists come to power in China, if that's what he's implying here. That changes the whole trajectory of the coming decades. You don't have a Korean War in that situation. You probably don't have Vietnam in that situation because you don't have this huge billion-person communist country that gives even more power and stability to the Soviets. The Soviets are much more by themselves. Boy, the whole 20th century looks different if that happens.
The Soviets are now more strategically positioned within Europe. The Asiatic communist sphere which had emerged in our world never forms. Indochina may remain under French control for a time, although the US would certainly take an active stance against both British and French colonialism, much as in our world. The Roosevelt administration and its successors had pushed the anti-colonial agenda since the outbreak of the war, the US making clear plans for ensuring self-determination in all post-war countries, although Churchill for a time asserted that this would only be the case for states under Axis occupation. These plans likely wouldn't change even if we assume Dewey beats Truman in the '48 election, as Dewey represented the pro-internationalism moderate faction of the Republican Party,
Right.
which would later come to form the Liberal Republicans. Britain and France, who are now in a more compromised position due to the USSR's expanded influence, are more reluctant to give up what were a tremendous source of wealth and resources, which would be direly needed to rebuild. We might imagine the US withholding aid from the Marshall Plan or imposing upon the two some form of economic penalty should they refuse. India, Morocco, Tunisia, and Indochina likely still break away. However, the two empires would grasp tightly upon the remaining territories, not trusting the US to fully ensure their security in the event of a Soviet attack.
So I'm curious to see, he just changed the color of a bunch of the old nations that made up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but also southern Germany. I'm wondering if he's implying that maybe there's a new German confederation there?
Looking to each other instead. Without the industrious lands of northern Germany, France and the Benelux countries are short a major member of what would have been the European coal and steel community. This alternate timeline might see Britain assume a leading role in what Churchill once described as a United States of Europe, or perhaps merely a Franco-British Union, operating as a third faction in the Cold War which represented the interests of Europe free from both American and Soviet domination, as well as pursued the continued success of the imperial and colonial systems. And that is where I'll end this video for now.
Okay, so I didn't have to hit myself over the face a single time with a box or anything else in that one. So interesting, well thought out, and I don't know if it's quite as detailed and as laid out as someone like Alternate History Hub, but still pretty good. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about everything he proposed, about what I suggested. Where do you see all of that happening if D-Day failed? What does that look like for the rest of the war? What then happens in the post-war world? Obviously, the further you get from the diverging event, the more difficult it can be to kind of decide what might happen. But I've got a lot of other alternate history videos out there. I'll throw up a link to the playlist for my alternate history videos, as well as the one to my other reaction to Monsieur Z, where I did beat myself in the face with a box. So check it out. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.